Today, our partners in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Houston announced charges against 14 members of the Bandidos outlaw motorcycle gang.
Law enforcement calls them criminals, but members will do anything to protect the club.
I've always tried to be a Bandito 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, no matter where I am.
That's how the Bandidos rose from a small group of bikers to an international outlaw motorcycle club. It started with one man who refused to come home quietly. Donald Eugene Chambers returned from Vietnam in the mid-1960s to a country that didn't welcome him back. Trained for combat but stripped of purpose, he decided if civilian life couldn't give him structure, he'd create his own. In 1966, in San Leon, Texas, Chambers founded the Bandidos Motorcycle Club with like-minded riders. Their emblem featured sombrero-wearing figure armed with a pistol and machete, painted in red and gold. Their initial members were oilfield hands workers, mechanics, veterans, blue-collar outsiders chasing belonging. Despite the minimal resources, Chambers maintained a military-like discipline. He ran meetings like army briefings where disobedience brought immediate consequences. By the late 1960s, Bandidos were able to maintain a presence across Texas. What began with a few restless men on bikes had grown into a brotherhood with rules. And with Texas locked down, the next step was obvious: expansion. Chapter 2: Expansion and Growth. From a single Texas chapter, the Bandidos spread like wildfire. In the next 20 years, their red and gold patch appeared on 3 continents. By the mid-1970s, the Bandidos had claimed the American South: Louisiana, Oklahoma, New Mexico. One by one, they pulled in smaller clubs with a clear message: patch over and gain protection, or get pushed aside. The model worked. Soon, Houston, Dallas, and San Antonio were strongholds. Then came the leap overseas. In 1983, a split inside Australia's Comanchero Motorcycle Club birthed the first Bandidos chapter in Sydney. Within a year, that defection turned bloody. The feud exploded into the Milpera Massacre, a Father's Day shootout that left 7 people dead, including an innocent teenager. While Australia descended into chaos, Europe became the next front. In 1989, the first chapter opened in Marseille, France. Within a few years, the patch appeared in Denmark and Sweden, where biker culture had been building for decades, but this move carried a price. In Scandinavia, the Hells Angels already dominated. The seeds of all-out war were planted. Their expansion was always the same: identify a disaffected local club, offer the Bandido name, discipline, and backing. If they refused, crush them. Amid the chaos, Chambers' blueprint kept spreading. By the end of the decade, the Bandidos had gone global, because their rapid rise meant one thing: a head-on collision with the Hells Angels was no longer a matter of if, it was when. Chapter 3: Rivalries with the Hells Angels. From the start, the Bandidos were chasing the same throne the Hells Angels already claimed. In the U.S., skirmishes broke out in border states over drug and gun routes. But in the 1990s, the rivalry truly exploded in Scandinavia, where both clubs were expanding aggressively. Small clashes over territory, street control, and recruitment spiraled into open war. Governments would later call it the Nordic Biker Warone of the bloodiest conflicts in outlaw biker history. In March 1996, Hells Angels gunmen ambushed Bandidos at Copenhagen Airport, killing chapter president Uffe Larsson and wounding 3 others. Hours later, another ambush hit Oslo Airport. The Bandidos struck back. Just months later, they fired a rocket into a Hells Angels clubhouse party in Copenhagen. 2 people were killed, including a young woman who wasn't part of the conflict, and 19 others were injured. Civilians were now dead, and outrage erupted. Law enforcement cracked down, but the violence only escalated. The Hells Angels answered with explosives. In Norway, a van packed with up to 50 kilograms of fertilizer-based explosives was detonated outside a Bandido clubhouse. A 51-year-old passerby was killed, 22 others were wounded, and the building was leveled. The intended target was Michael Garcia Lerche Olsen, a former Hells Angel who had defected to the Bandidos, survived. Days later, more Bandidos were gunned down. The war was fully underway. By 1997, nearly 100 men were dead, including civilians. The pressure on both clubs was immense. That September, the presidents of the Bandidos and Hells Angels sat side by side on Danish television, shaking hands in an uneasy truce. The Nordic biker war had left dozens dead, governments mobilized, and entire nations outraged. For the Angels, it was about guarding supremacy. For the Bandidos, it proved they could stand shoulder to shoulder with the world's most feared patch. The handshake did not erase the blood, but it ended a war too costly to continue. The rivalry, however, never ended, only shifted. In 2010, another peace deal was signed in Germany, dividing territory under government pressure. Police dismissed it as a media stunt, and while it curbed bloodshed locally, the hostility endured elsewhere. In Scandinavia, shootings returned. In North America and Australia, the feud remained violent and open. The lesson was simple. Every truce between the Hells Angels and Bandidos has been written in temporary ink. Rivalry is the engine that drives them both, and peace lasts only as long as survival demands it. Chapter 4: Law Enforcement Crackdowns. By the 1990s, the Bandidos were under attack on two fronts. Rivals challenged them in the streets, while governments across the world sought to dismantle them in courts. What followed was a decades-long campaign of raids, indictments, and bans that reshaped the club's identity. The campaign intensified in Operation 1%er, 1985 to 1986, when ATF agents conducted raids in 18 states against multiple outlaw clubs, including the Bandidos. 68 people were arrested, and caches of illegal weapons and drugs were seized. The message was clear. The federal government was willing to pursue biker gangs as organized crime syndicates. Europe soon followed. German and Danish authorities raided clubhouses, seizing assault rifles, bulletproof vests, and financial records tying members to extortion and contract killings. Germany went further, declaring the Bandidos a criminal association, which allowed police to ban chapters and confiscate assets outright. In 2017, the Netherlands became the first country to dissolve its national chapter in court, ruling that the club posed a permanent threat to public order. Canada mounted its own offensive during and after the Quebec Biker War. When the rock machine patched over to the Bandidos in 2002, police struck back with Operation Amigo, arresting 62 members and associates in coordinated raids. The result was decisive. Within months, the Bandidos' presence in Quebec collapsed. The courtroom became the new battlefield. Prosecutors in Scandinavia reported threats, while in Australia, police officers who disrupted drug routes were assaulted. In the US, the goal was to prove that violence came from the top, not just rogue riders. That strategy culminated in the 2018 San Antonio trial of Jeffrey Fay Pike and John Xavier Portillo, the national president and vice president. After a 3-month trial, both men were convicted on all counts, including racketeering, conspiracy, and ordering murders.
The verdict is now in. 2 top former Bandidos, National President Jeffrey Fay Pike and ex-Vice President John Xavier Portillo, found guilty in a 13-count indictment.
Testimony tied them directly to the killing of Anthony Benish, who had attempted to start a rival Hells Angels chapter in Texas. Pike was sentenced to life plus 10 years. Portillo received 2 consecutive life sentences without parole. It was the first time U.S. prosecutors had dismantled the Bandidos' top command in open court. Other crackdowns followed. The aftermath of the 2015 Waco Shootout, where 9 bikers were killed in a gun battle with the Cossacks, brought mass arrests and sweeping charges. Although most cases collapsed, the national leadership was hit hard. Pike and Portillo's indictments stemmed partly from this climate of pressure. The latest offensive came in February 2025, when federal prosecutors unsealed a 22-count RICO indictment against 14 members in Houston. The charges murder, robbery, racketeering stemmed from a bloody turf war with a rival gang called BEAST. Investigators described a smash-on-sight order from Bandido leadership, directing members to attack rivals wherever they were found. For decades, the Bandidos prided themselves on brotherhood and defiance. But in courtrooms, prosecutors painted them as nothing less than a mafia on motorcycles. Each operation weakened them, but none destroyed them. The club adapted, shifting its strategies and leadership to survive. Chapter 5: Lawsuits and Bans. By the 2000s, the war against the Bandidos shifted from the streets to the courts. Prosecutors no longer focused on individual crimes. They aimed to dismantle the club itself. In the United States, federal indictments stacked up against Bandido leaders. Prosecutors leaned on the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, tying assaults, drug trafficking, and extortion directly to the organization. In 2006, Washington state leaders were charged with conspiracy to distribute meth and cocaine. In 2009, dozens of Texas members faced federal charges for murder conspiracy and narcotics trafficking. Each guilty verdict under RICO treated the Bandidos as a criminal enterprise, threatening to collapse entire chapters. Europe moved even harder. German states banned the Bandidos outright after repeated clashes and organized crime links, shutting down clubhouses in Berlin, Cologne, and Hamburg. In 2014, the Netherlands declared the Bandidos illegal nationwide, ruling the club a permanent danger to public order. In 2018, an appeals court upheld the decision, confirming that the group operated in a culture of violence. The pattern spread. In May 2024, Denmark imposed a temporary ban on its national branch of the Bandidos, citing escalating violence. Prosecutors argued the club was a united criminal entity despite appearing decentralized. The move mirrored the successful dissolution of Loyal to Familia, Denmark's most notorious street gang, and signaled that outlaw motorcycle clubs could face the same fate. Sweden followed with its own pressure. In May 2025, the Migration Court deported 3 foreign Bandidos members and barred them from re-entry for 8 years, citing national security risks. The pressure wasn't confined to Europe. In Houston, a federal grand jury returned a 22-count indictment in 2024 against 14 Bandidos and associates from the Welcome to Hell chapter. Prosecutors alleged a turf war with rival gangs that left 2 people dead and included shootings in bars and on highways. The indictment described a smash-on-sight order from Bandidos leadership targeting a rival crew, and charges ranged from racketeering and arson to murder and drug trafficking. Governments framed these bans and indictments as necessary to protect public order. Judges and prosecutors faced threats, and in Germany, police officers investigating Bandidos chapters reported being ambushed near their homes. The message from authorities was clear. Outlaw motorcycle clubs weren't just a nuisance. They were organized crime groups testing the strength of the state itself. Despite the pressure, the Bandidos adapted. Some chapters went underground, others rebranded under new names, and recruitment continued in regions with weaker enforcement. But each courtroom battle chipped away at the club's freedom to operate openly. At stake was more than the fate of individual members. Every indictment and ban asked the same question: could the Bandidos survive as a global brotherhood, or would governments finally force them into collapse? Chapter 6: Internal Conflicts and Leadership Struggles. The brotherhood that once promised strength began to splinter from within. Growth brought power, but power brought ambition. As the Bandidos expanded across continents, disputes over money, territory, and control escalated. National presidents struggled to command chapters spread across thousands of miles, and local leaders often challenged their authority. Some regions rebelled outright. In the late 1990s, a European faction broke away entirely, claiming the international leadership no longer represented them. Loyalty to the patch was no longer enough to guarantee unity. Defections made the fractures worse. Members who abandoned the club often carried secrets into rival organizations, arming the Hells Angels, the Outlaws, or the Cossacks with inside knowledge. This betrayal raised the stakes, since trust the foundation of the brotherhood and carried the risk of exposure. Leadership mistakes deepened the crisis. Decisions on alliances and money distribution often favored certain chapters over others. creating resentment. When leaders failed to enforce consistent rules, chapters invented their own systems of discipline. Some embraced extreme violence as independence, others tried to pursue legitimacy, and the result was fragmentation. Everything looked stable. It was not. Internal records revealed sudden expulsions of respected figures, many of them power plays disguised as discipline. The purges shocked members who once believed the brotherhood was sacred. At times, the fractures turned deadly. In Canada, 2006 saw one of the most brutal examples of infighting, the Shedden Massacre. Tensions between the Winnipeg and Toronto chapters spiraled when Winnipeg leader Michael Sandom accused Toronto's Giovanni Musadere of financial mismanagement. Houston's leadership expelled the Toronto men and ordered them to surrender their patches. They refused, calling themselves the No Surrender Crew. The result was an ambush on a rural Ontario farm. 8 Bandidos were executed by their own brothers, their bodies left in cars along a dirt road. The slaughter stunned the world and effectively ended the Bandidos' Canadian presence. That same year, Australia erupted in its own feud. A dispute over millions in stolen pseudoephedrine fractured the Sydney chapter. Felix Big F. Lyle, once a powerful figure, was expelled, while his protege Dallas Fitzgerald turned against Rodney Hooks Monk, the man who replaced him. Monk was kidnapped, tortured, and later killed. In 2011, Lyle defected to the Hells Angels, taking as many as 60 Bandidos with him in exchange for millions of mass defection that remains one of the largest in biker history. In Scandinavia, internal wars were just as vicious. In Finland, President Marco Hirsma's expulsion in 1999 set off a bloody feud. Hirsma tried to establish his own club, only to be hunted by the very organization he once led. In 2001, gunmen shot him dead in front of his home. The murder proved how far the Bandidos were willing to go to silence dissent. Even in recent years, splintering has continued. In 2016, disillusioned members in Texas formed the Kinfolk Motorcycle Club, branding themselves as an alternative to Bandido hierarchy. The split quickly turned violent. In 2017, Kinfolk gunmen murdered Bandidos El Paso President Juan Martinez Jr. in a Texas bar fight. The shooter was sentenced to 56 years in prison, but the feud still simmers. The consequences of these divisions were clear. International meetings meant to unify the brotherhood became arenas of suspicion. Purges silenced rivals, and breakaway clubs carried knowledge into enemy hands. At stake was not just the reputation of the Bandidos, but the survival of the organization itself. If unchecked, internal wars threatened to fracture the brotherhood beyond repair. Yet despite these wounds, the Bandidos endured. Each rebellion reshaped the hierarchy but never destroyed the network. Chapter 7: Media Portrayals and Public Perception. For the Bandidos, media images often decided how the world judged them. From Texas to Europe, news outlets framed the club less as a brotherhood and more as a criminal empire dressed in leather. Once that image hardened, it proved nearly impossible to reverse. In the 1970s and 1980s, local papers regularly reported on arrests, bar fights, and shootings tied to the patch. Each story added to a growing narrative of lawlessness. By the 1990s, international outlets picked up the thread, linking the Bandidos to the Nordic biker wars and presenting them as a global menace. Television paired news of raids and indictments with footage of riders in formation, their colors flashing against chrome and leather. The effect was simple and powerful. Before audiences heard a word, they associated the patch with violence. This framing only deepened as law enforcement operations gained visibility. Undercover ATF stings and FBI-led investigations were widely covered. Reports emphasized drug trafficking, meth and cocaine distribution, illegal weapons stockpiles, and patches earned for violence. Even when trials ended without convictions, the headlines had already reinforced the impression of the Bandidos as a cartel on wheels. The club did try to fight back against this narrative. Chapters highlighted charity rides, toy drives, and fundraisers for veterans and families in need. Human interest stories occasionally broke through, with local media covering food donations or interviews that emphasized loyalty and brotherhood. But these stories rarely spread beyond biker circles. They were drowned out by headlines of raids and funerals. For every quiet act of charity, there was a louder report of murder or conspiracy. This dual perception carried weight. For governments and police, the criminal image justified aggressive raids, indictments, and even outright bans. A frightened community was far more likely to support laws that dissolved chapters and confiscated property. For members, reputation worked in two directions. It damaged their legal standing, but also drew recruits. Young riders joined partly because the outlaw image promised danger, respect, and notoriety. By the early 2000s, the Bandidos were no longer just another motorcycle club in the public imagination. They had become a cultural archetype, shorthand for the outlaw biker itself. The club's own attempts to shift its image toward loyalty, charity, and family could not outweigh decades of headlines, raids, and crime stories. Then, in May 2015, a Twin Peaks restaurant in Waco, Texas, turned that image into reality. Cameras rolled, gunfire erupted, and the Bandidos were thrust into the deadliest public biker shootout in American history. Chapter 8: The Waco Shootout. Smoke and gunfire ripped through the parking lot of a Twin Peaks in Waco, Texas. What began as a routine coalition meeting of motorcycle clubs became the deadliest public biker confrontation in U.S. history. Tension had been building for months. The Bandidos and the Cossacks were already colliding over territory, dues, and the right to wear the Texas bottom rocker. Police intelligence flagged the meeting as high risk, so Waco officers and Texas troopers staged outside before the first bikes rolled in. The spark was small and fast. An argument over parking and patches at the entrance spilled into shoves, then knives, then guns. Shots cracked across the lot. Cars and storefront glass took rounds. Patrons dropped under tables. Staff barricaded kitchens and bathrooms. Officers outside moved immediately and returned fire under active shooter protocols. When the shooting stopped, 9 men were dead, and at least 18 more were wounded, nearly all by gunfire. The scene bodies under sheets, bikes scattered, rifles level dominated national news within hours. By nightfall, 177 people were in custody on organized crime charges, many facing $1 million bonds. Over the next 4 years, cases collapsed. Judges tossed charges, juries deadlocked, and evidence fell short. The only trial of a Bandido chapter president ended in mistrial. By April 2019, the remaining criminal cases were dismissed. No one was convicted of murder for the 9 deaths. The fallout cut both ways. For law enforcement, Waco became a cautionary tale about overbroad arrests, sky-high bonds, and a prosecution strategy that could not carry the burden of proof. For the Bandidos, the imagery was indelible. A public gun battle that reinforced their notoriety and invited fresh scrutiny of every chapter in Texas. Everything looked settled in court. It wasn't. Civil rights suits surged against local and state officials, challenging the mass arrests and prolonged detentions. The fight moved from crime scenes to courtrooms and city budgets. After Waco, the question was simple and brutal. Could the Bandidos survive the combined weight of public outrage, failed prosecutions, and constant monitoring? Or would pressure and internal fractures finally split the brotherhood for good? Chapter 9: Legacy and Transformation. Today, the Bandidos remain one of the world's most infamous outlaw clubs, spread across 20 countries and hundreds of chapters. But survival now depends less on street fights and more on courtrooms. In 2025, 14 Houston area members were indicted under RICO, accused of waging a violent turf war with a rival group called Beast. Prosecutors cited shootings, arsons, and even a national smash-on-sight order from leadership. Europe moved in step. Denmark imposed a temporary ban. Spain and Germany staged raids, and defections in the Ruhr region saw over 100 Bandidos switch to the Hells Angels. The stakes are simple. If bans and prosecutions dismantle leadership, the club risks fracturing into fiefdoms. If defections accelerate, the brand itself could fade. Yet the Bandidos endure. Some chapters go underground, others double down. The myth of brotherhood still recruits, even as trials and bans strip away freedom. Legacy now means proving whether the patch can outlast governments, rivals, and time itself. The war for dominance in the outlaw world is never over. The enemies of the most infamous club have written history in blood, and their next move is already unfolding. Click on the next video to see how far these rivalries can go.